Imagine you're Kenya's finance minister, staring at a screen in Nairobi. Brent crude just crossed $117. Your country spends more on fuel imports than it earns from its top 3 exports combined. And $300 billion in dollar-denominated debt is coming due across 12 nations in 26 and 27. This is the story of how the same trap that broke Latin America in 1982 is closing again, and why 12 countries may not escape it. Egypt, Kenya, Ghana, Pakistan, El Salvador, Ethiopia. Their bonds are collapsing, their currencies are falling, and their debt payments are coming due. Every barrel of oil they buy drains the foreign reserves they need to service their debts. Pakistan's current account deficit has widened every single month this year. Meanwhile, the Federal Reserve is holding rates at 3.5% to 3.75%. No cut in sight. So the dollar stays strong, and dollar-denominated debt gets heavier with every passing week. The math is brutal. When your currency loses value, but your debts are priced in dollars, you need more local money to make the same payment. 12 countries, all facing the same trap at the same time. Expensive oil, expensive debt, shrinking reserves. This looks like a new crisis, something specific to 2026, but it is not new at all. In 1982, the exact same mechanism broke Latin America for an entire decade, and the playbook was identical. The story begins with oil, but not with the crisis itself. In 1973, the OPEC oil embargo quadrupled the price of a barrel in less than a year. Oil-producing nations suddenly held enormous dollar surpluses. Those petrodollars had to go somewhere. OPEC governments deposited billions into Western commercial banks. Citibank, Chase Manhattan, Bank of America, suddenly flush with cash and desperate to lend. They found eager borrowers in Latin America. Mexico wanted to industrialize. Brazil was building highways and dams. Argentina was modernizing agriculture. Peru was expanding its mining sector. The loans came fast, with floating interest rates pegged to the dollar. The terms looked generous because rates in the late 70s were still low. Everyone assumed the same thing. Commodity prices would keep rising. The debts would pay for themselves. No one asked what would happen if interest rates doubled. By 1980, Latin America's external debt had quadrupled. $75 billion in 1975 had become over $300 billion in just 5 years. $300 billion. Most of it owed to commercial banks. Most of it at variable rates. Most of it denominated in dollars the borrowers did not print. Then the music stopped. Paul Volcker, chairman of the Federal Reserve, launched an aggressive war on inflation. The federal funds rate climbed to 20%. 20%. For any government holding floating rate dollar debt, this was catastrophic. Interest payments doubled. The strong dollar made every payment heavier in local currency terms. For a government clerk in Mexico City, the math arrived as a pay freeze. For a school teacher in Buenos Aires, it arrived as an empty pharmacy shelf. On August 12, 1982, Mexico's finance minister, Jesus Silva Herzog, called the United States Treasury. His message was simple: Mexico cannot pay. That phone call changed everything. It triggered a chain reaction that no one could stop. Within weeks, bankers in New York ran the same calculation for every borrower on their books. Brazil, Argentina, Chile, Peru, Venezuela, Bolivia, all in the same position. The loans that Western banks had made with OPEC's petrodollars were now worthless on paper. Citibank alone had lent more to Latin America than its entire capital base. If even one major borrower defaulted permanently, it could bring down the American banking system. The International Monetary Fund stepped in with emergency lending. But the rescue came with conditions: brutal austerity. Governments slashed public spending. They froze wages. They cut subsidies on food and fuel. The goal was to prove to the banks that these countries could still pay. The cost was paid by ordinary citizens who had never seen a single dollar of the borrowed money. What followed became known as the Lost Decade. Latin America's GDP growth fell below 1% per year for nearly 10 years. A nurse in Sao Paulo watched her monthly salary buy fewer groceries each week. Real wages dropped 30 to 40%. Argentina and Brazil spiraled into hyperinflation. Public hospitals ran out of medicine. Schools fell apart. Entire families left for the United States, Europe, anywhere that offered work. A generation of economic progress erased in less than 5 years. Children born in 1982 grew up in economies that were smaller than the ones their parents inherited. And here is the part that most people miss. These countries did not borrow recklessly because their leaders were foolish. They borrowed because the system rewarded borrowing. The same oil shock that enriched lenders impoverished borrowers. Petrodollars flowed from OPEC to Western banks to Latin American governments and back to the West as debt payments. It was a circle, and when interest rates rose, the circle became a noose. Now look at 2026. Oil above $100 a barrel is crushing import bills for energy-dependent developing nations. The Fed's rate hold means dollar-denominated debt remains expensive. Urea prices are up 46%, adding a food inflation layer that the 1980s did not have. For food-insecure nations carrying heavy debt, this is a double squeeze that 1982 never produced. Their people are paying more for food. Their governments are paying more for energy. And both are paying more for debt they took on when conditions were kinder. The BU report identifies 12 countries in the danger zone right now. A farmer outside Nairobi is paying twice what he paid last year for fertilizer, and his wheat crop earns less in dollars every harvest. Their energy bills are rising, their food costs are rising, their debt service costs are rising, and their currencies are falling against the dollar they owe. The parallels to 1982 are structural, not superficial. In both cases, an oil shock generated surpluses that were recycled as debt into vulnerable economies. In both cases, a strong dollar and high American interest rates made that debt unbearable. In both cases, the borrowing nations had no control over the forces destroying them. But there are differences. In 1982, the creditors were commercial banks. They could negotiate because their own survival depended on it. Today, the debt is held by bondholders, anonymous, dispersed, harder to coordinate. There is no single bank to call. Restructuring is slower. Default is messier. Sri Lanka defaulted in 2022. Its restructuring took over 2 years. Ghana's is still ongoing. Zambia waited 3 years before creditors agreed on terms. The 1982 crisis taught the world a lesson it refused to learn. When oil makes the rich world richer and the poor world poorer, the debts do not disappear. They compound. The lost decade was not inevitable. It was engineered by a system that treated developing nations as outlets for surplus capital and then punished them when conditions changed. 12 countries are staring at that same machinery today. The loans are different, The lenders are different, but the trap is the same. Oil shock, dollar strength, crushing debt, and nations that did not create the crisis left to absorb its consequences. 44 years after that phone call from Mexico City, the question is no longer whether history repeats. It is whether anyone remembers the answer.